Did you know that the famous Las Vegas Strip could have had its own mini version of London? And that to this day, Cincinnati sits on more than 2 miles of abandoned tunnels, built more than a century ago. From a spectacular failure to build the country's biggest nuclear power plants to spending $12 billion on a science megaproject that ultimately went to waste, we bring you some of the biggest abandoned megaprojects in the US. Don't miss out as we go from state to state and take a closer look at what went wrong for these multi-billion-dollar plans that had to be scaled back, canceled, or abandoned. Starting with the Las Vegas Strip has been America's go-to-entertainment destination for decades. It is home to some of the world's biggest entertainment venues and iconic landmarks. However, while the Vegas Strip tells thousands of stories of success, it has had its fair share of abandoned megaprojects. One such plan was to build a 77-acre London-themed casino development across from Mandalay Bay. Old motels in the area were demolished, but World Port was never built. The development was going to cost $1.8 billion and would include famous British landmarks like Big Ben, Tower Bridge, and the London Eye. Guests could ride boats down a small version of the River Thames, watch a daily changing of the guard show, and enjoy classic pubs and theater performances like the ones in London's West End. The mega resort was planned to have 1,300 hotel rooms and a 500-foot-tall observation wheel named Sky View. Construction got delayed as the 2008 financial crisis made it hard to get funding for the entire project. The plan wasn't canceled altogether, however. The only construction that did materialize was on the Skyview Ferris wheel. Announced in 2011, the $200 million Ferris wheel would give visitors the unparalleled view of Sin City. A 1950s-era motel was demolished to make way for a mixed-use complex that would feature the giant wheel, a roller coaster, and 200,000 square feet of restaurant, retail, and entertainment venues. Foundation work began in 2012 with the opening date slated for July 2013. The project was planned to employ roughly 700 people during the construction phase, followed by 500 full-time jobs once the venue got operational. Once completed, the wheel was supposed to be the most notable fixture of a city where there is no shortage of eye-catching infrastructure. The towering structure would feature 32 gondolas that each seat 24 people. This was the tallest billboard in the world. Howard Bullock was confident of the wheel's success, saying, "Every airplane that flies in and out of Vegas will fly past that wheel." The confidence also came from the popularity of its inspiration, the London Eye. The wheel in London attracted more than 3 million visitors per year, and the Skyview aimed to top that. However, as soon as the construction began, the project ran into funding problems. Only a third of the required funds was secured through a Seattle businessman who brought lawsuits against Bullock afterwards. While Skyview was mired in controversy, its competitors were motoring ahead. Caesars Entertainment landed financing for its wheel before construction started. The gaming giant's version of the wheel, the High Roller, opened in 2014, further complicating the future for Skyview. It wasn't long before the project stalled altogether. When it was abandoned, the only construction were 2 massive concrete support columns visible from a distance. Despite multiple attempts to sell the property since 2015, the site remains undeveloped today. From high up in the Vegas skyline, we move to Cincinnati, Ohio, where the city tried to build its first subway system more than a century ago. Cincinnati in the 1910s was growing fast and choking on its own success. The city's population had doubled in 20 years. Streetcars were packed beyond capacity, and traffic clogged downtown streets that were never designed for automobile traffic. City planners looked at what New York and Boston had done with underground rapid transit and decided Cincinnati needed the same subway solution. The plan approved in 1916 called for a 16-mile subway loop connecting downtown Cincinnati to surrounding neighborhoods. Trains would run underground through the city center, then emerge to street level in outlying areas where land was cheaper and tunneling unnecessary. The subway would relieve the overcrowded streetcar system and position Cincinnati as a modern city with infrastructure rivaling the East Coast's major metros. The projected cost was $6 million, though that number would prove spectacularly wrong. Cincinnati voters approved a bond issue to fund construction, and work began in 1920 with major optimism speeches about the city's future. Workers started excavating tunnels beneath downtown streets, boring through rock and clay to create passages wide enough for two-track rapid transit. In some sections, they bored through solid rock, using techniques adapted from mining. Progress was visible as streets got torn up and tunnel portals appeared where the subway would emerge from underground. By 1922, substantial progress had been made. Over 2 miles of tunnel were complete beneath downtown Cincinnati, including the main tube running under Central Parkway and Race Street. The tunnels were arched concrete structures 20 feet wide and 18 feet high, large enough for subway trains with room for ventilation and utilities. 6 stations were under construction, with platforms roughed out and spaces excavated for entrances and exits. But costs were spiraling beyond anyone's projections. The $6 million bond issue was consumed by 1922, with only a fraction of the planned system complete. Excavating through Cincinnati's difficult geology proved more expensive than estimated. Labor costs increased after World War I. Materials became more expensive as post-war inflation hit. City officials went back to voters asking for more money and got rejected. The public had approved $6 million for a complete subway system, not an open-ended commitment to fund cost overruns. The automobile boom was changing the calculation too. When planning began in 1916, cars were luxury items and most people relied on streetcars. By 1923, automobile ownership was spreading rapidly and city officials were starting to think that maybe investing in roads made more sense than building expensive subway tunnels. The streetcar companies that supported the subway initially were now worried that rapid transit would compete with their services. Construction slowed through 1923 and 1924 as funding dried up and political support weakened. Workers completed some sections they'd already started, but no new tunnel excavation began. The project entered a zombie state, not officially canceled, but not actively progressing either, with city officials arguing about whether to find more money or cut their losses. In 1925, Cincinnati officially halted construction on the subway. About 2.2 miles of tunnel were complete, along with partially finished station structures, representing maybe 15% of the original plan. The completed sections sat there underground, empty and useless because they didn't connect to anything. The city explored various ideas for using the tunnels. Maybe they could be converted for automobile traffic. Maybe utilities could use them. Maybe they could be storage facilities. None of these ideas made financial sense as they would require expensive modifications. Eventually, the decision was taken to seal the tunnels and simply abandon the Megaproject. The entrances were sealed, construction equipment was removed, and the underground spaces were left empty. For decades, the Cincinnati subway existed as one of America's oddest infrastructure failures. Miles of tunnel sitting unused beneath a major city because nobody could figure out what to do with them. Through the decades, the tunnels became urban legend. People knew they existed, but few had seen inside. Water seeped in from groundwater, and some sections flooded partially, but the concrete structures remained intact. The Megaproject saw brief consideration for reactivation several times. In the 1930s, there was talk of completing the system as a WPA project. In the 1950s, officials discussed using them for civil defense shelters. In the 1980s and 2000s, various proposals suggested converting them into a light rail line or subway. None of these ideas progressed beyond planning stages. The costs of completing or converting the tunnels always exceeded what Cincinnati was willing to spend. A century later, the Cincinnati subway tunnels are still there, exactly where they were abandoned in 1925. The city occasionally opens them for public tours, allowing people to walk through the empty concrete passages and see the platforms that never served passengers. The tunnels to this day are in remarkable condition. The concrete is solid, the arches are intact, and they look like they could be put into service. However, the stations look like eerie time capsules. Platform edges are visible where subway trains would have stopped. Spaces excavated for ticket booths and entrances remain empty. It's like walking through a subway system that was frozen in time. Cincinnati spent $13 million on the project in the 1920s, equivalent to $200 million in today's money, but all they managed to build was 2.2 miles of tunnel that never transported a passenger. From Ohio, we now move to Indiana, to one of the most expensive abandoned nuclear construction projects in U.S. history. In 1977, the Public Service Company of Indiana broke ground on what was supposed to be the future of clean energy in the Midwest. Marble Hill Nuclear Power Plant would house two massive Westinghouse pressurized water reactors, each generating 1,130 megawatts, enough to power over 1 million homes. The plant would sit on the Ohio River near Hanover, Indiana, positioned to serve the growing electricity demands of Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio for the next 50 years. The design was nearly identical to the Byron and Braidwood nuclear stations being built in Illinois. Two containment buildings would house the reactors, backed by cooling towers that would use river water to manage the tremendous heat. The estimated cost was around $1.4 billion, and completion was targeted for the early 1980s. PSY and its partner utilities were confident. Nuclear power was America's future, replacing dirty coal plants with clean atomic energy. Construction moved quickly through 1977 and 1978. Workers poured massive foundations and began erecting the distinctive concrete domes that define nuclear plants. The two cooling tower complexes rose nearby. By 1979, the site employed thousands of construction workers, and the project seemed on track despite some early skepticism from environmental groups. The Paddle Wheel Alliance, a regional advocacy organization, staged two nonviolent occupations of the property in 1978 and 1979, but construction continued anyway. But just as it felt things were going smoothly, the 3 Mile Island incident happened. On March 28, 1979, a reactor at the Pennsylvania plant suffered a partial meltdown, causing the worst nuclear accident in U.S. history. Nobody died, but the incident terrified the public and transformed nuclear regulation overnight. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission imposed stricter safety requirements, extended review processes, and demanded design changes for plants under construction. What had been routine approvals became years-long battles. Marble Hill's costs started climbing immediately. The new regulations required design modifications, additional safety systems, and more extensive documentation. Construction slowed as engineers redesigned components to meet new standards. Then it was found that the concrete work on the foams was below the acceptable standard, compromising their compromised structural integrity. Fixing this required tearing out sections and redoing the work, a process that consumed months and millions of dollars. By 1981, the cost estimate had more than doubled to over $3 billion. PSY asked Indiana regulators for permission to charge customers for construction work in progress, making the consumers fund an unfinished plant through higher electric bills. The request ignited political controversy. Why should customers pay for a plant that wasn't generating electricity and might never be completed? An already weak local support turned into hostility. By 1983, almost half of the construction was complete. However, the plant was nowhere close to finishing. The rest of the work was more complex and required more investment. PSI ran the numbers and faced a grim reality. They'd spent $2.5 billion and needed at least another $4 billion to finish, nearly triple the original estimate. The company couldn't raise that much capital without bankrupting itself. Indiana's governor, Robert Orr, publicly stated that completing Marble Hill would push PSI into bankruptcy and cause electric rates to skyrocket, devastating the state's economy. On January 10, 1984, PSY officially halted construction. The announcement devastated Jefferson County. Over 3,500 construction workers were laid off overnight. The county's unemployment rate spiked to 24.8%, one of the highest in the nation. Families that had moved to the area for stable nuclear construction jobs suddenly had nothing. The economic impact rippled through local businesses that had depended on thousands of workers with steady paychecks. The $2.8 billion spent was gone, and Marble Hill became the most expensive abandoned nuclear project in American history. PSY tried to salvage what it could. In 1985, They staged an auction selling reactor hardware, generators, and equipment to other utilities. The sale raised about $90 million against a $1.65 billion debt, recovering less than 6 cents on the dollar. The components that were supposed to power Indiana's future ended up installed at nuclear plants in other states. The legal battles consumed years. PSI wanted to recover its investment by charging ratepayers, arguing that the plant was abandoned for reasons beyond their control. Consumer advocates argued that customers shouldn't pay for a plant that would never generate electricity. The Indiana courts eventually sided largely with consumers, denying PSY's attempts to fully recover its losses. The structures abandoned in 1984 remained standing for decades after abandonment. The containment buildings stood as massive concrete monuments to failure, visible for miles around. The site was sold to an agricultural equipment company in 1998, then to a Michigan company in 2005, but nothing was ever built. Demolition of the premises finally began in 2005 and accelerated in the next couple of years. The turbine building proved tougher than expected. The first implosion attempt using dynamite failed to budge the massive 5-story structure. A second demolition effort finally collapsed it. By 2010, most of the structures were gone, the site largely cleared except for some foundations that were too expensive to remove. Today, little evidence remains that Marble Hill was ever there. The land where 2 nuclear reactors were supposed to generate electricity for 50 years is empty. Speaking of demolishing old infrastructure let's move to Chicago, Illinois, where the country's tallest skyscraper was once taking shape. The Chicago skyline defined American architecture for over a century. It is the birthplace of the skyscraper with buildings like the Sears Tower and the John Hancock Center. But by the 2000s, the city had fallen behind in the super tall building race. New York had new towers going up. Dubai was building the Burj Khalifa, and Chicago's last major skyscraper had topped out in the 1970s. Christopher T. Carley, CEO of Fordham development firm, tried to change that as he hired famous Spanish architect Santiago Calatrava to design the Chicago Spire. It was going to be the tallest residential building in the world. The initial estimated cost of the project was close to $1 billion. However, Fordham Development failed to secure the necessary funds and sold the land to Garrett Kelleher of Shelbourne Development. The Chicago Spire would climb 2,000 feet, 150 stories of twisted glass and steel, rising from a lakefront site where the Chicago River meets Lake Michigan. Santiago Calatrava, the Spanish architect famous for bridges and buildings that looked more like sculptures than structures, designed a tower that rotated as it climbed, each floor turning slightly from the one below to create a spiraling form. Calatrava's twisting tower would be unlike anything in Chicago's famously conservative skyline. The building would be taller than any structure between New York and Los Angeles, reclaiming Chicago's position as the city of bold architecture. It would contain luxury condominiums and penthouses going for over $40 million. Kelleher's company, Shelbourne Development, promised completion by 2012. Construction began in 2007 with excavation for the foundation. The site sat right on the lakefront, which meant building below the water table. Workers had to dig down 110 feet to reach bedrock stable enough to anchor a 2,000-foot tower, essentially creating a massive hole that extended below the level of Lake Michigan. Pumps ran continuously to keep groundwater out while crews installed the foundation. The excavation revealed the first serious problem. The geology was worse than surveys had suggested. The bedrock was deeper and less stable than expected, requiring more extensive foundation work. Each delay cost money and pushed the timeline back. By late 2008, only the hole existed, 110 feet deep and 76 feet in diameter, an enormous circular pit that would supposedly anchor America's tallest residential building. Then, the financial crisis hit. The September 2008 collapse of Lehman Brothers and the subsequent economic meltdown destroyed the luxury condo market overnight. Buyers who'd put down deposits started backing out, unwilling or unable to complete purchases on multi-million-dollar apartments. The financing Shelbourne Development had arranged evaporated as banks stopped lending for speculative real estate. Credit markets froze, and luxury developments across America ground to a halt. Kelleher tried to keep the project alive through 2009, renegotiating with lenders and promising buyers that construction would resume soon. But the economics had changed completely. Even if financing could be found, who would buy $40 million penthouses during the worst recession in 80 years? In 2010, Shelbourne Development defaulted on a $76 million construction loan. The hope for Chicago Spire died with that bankruptcy. At the time, the only thing that existed was the 76-foot pit that had cost tens of millions to excavate and required constant pumping to prevent flooding from groundwater and Lake Michigan seepage. Completing the Spire would require over $2 billion in new financing and finding buyers for condos in a market that had collapsed. Pursuing a scaled-back version would require new designs, new permits, and would lose the Calatrava cachet that was supposed to justify the premium prices. Leaving the hole empty meant paying for pumping and security indefinitely. None of the choices were good. The hole sat there for years, this massive excavation on prime lakefront property surrounded by construction fencing. Pumps ran continuously to keep it from flooding, costing money every day while generating zero revenue. The site became an embarrassment, a literal hole in Chicago's skyline where the tallest building in America was supposed to stand. That was until the construction site was taken over by development firm Related Midwest, and they hired Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, the architecture firm that designed the One World Trade Center. But that did not mean a lease of life for Chicago Spire. In fact, it was announced that the plan for America's tallest skyscraper was officially dead. Instead, it will be replaced by two new skyscrapers with more modest heights of 266 meters and 233 meters respectively. The first goal for the new partners was to fill the hole left behind by the Chicago Spire, and they started doing that in 2021, using hundreds of tons of concrete and steel reinforcements. And 4 years later, the new building has started taking shape and has even reached a third of the final expected height. While the Chicago Spire was replaced with a different megaproject, Alaska's billion-dollar plan remains stalled to this day. Ketchikan, Alaska has a problem that's existed since the town was founded. The airport is on the wrong island. The town sits on Revillagigedo Island with about 8,000 residents, while Ketchikan International Airport sits across the Tongass Narrows on Gravina Island, which has about 50 people. Getting between the town and its airport requires a 7-minute ferry ride that runs every half hour. Miss the ferry and you miss your flight. The ferry stops running at night, stranding late arrivals at the airport until morning. In the late 1990s, Alaska's congressional delegation proposed a solution: build a bridge connecting Ketchikan to Gravina Island. The Gravina Island Bridge would span the Tongass Narrows with a structure tall enough for cruise ships to pass underneath, requiring a bridge deck about 200 feet above the water. The bridge would be nearly as long as the Golden Gate Bridge, but serving a town of 8,000 people and an island with almost nobody on it. The bridge made some sense from Ketchikan's perspective. The ferry was inconvenient and unreliable in bad weather. Winter storms occasionally shut it down entirely, cutting the town off from its airport. A bridge would provide 24/7 access and allow future development on Gravina Island. Alaska's congressional delegation argued that Ketchikan deserved the same kind of infrastructure investment that mainland cities received. However, the estimated cost was $398 million in federal funding, requested as part of Alaska's transportation appropriations. To put that in perspective, that's roughly $50,000 per Ketchikan resident for a bridge replacing a ferry that cost $1 million annually to operate. Congressman Don Young and Senator Ted Stevens championed the project, using their powerful positions to secure funding through the 2005 federal transportation bill. Despite the funding passed, a $398 million bridge to connect 8,000 people to an island with 50 residents looked absurd to everyone outside Alaska. The media started calling it the Bridge to Nowhere, a label that stuck and transformed the project into a national symbol of wasteful government spending. Critics pointed out that you could buy every Ketchikan resident a private Learjet for less money than the bridge would cost. The political damage was done. Taxpayer advocacy groups used it in ads attacking a wasteful government. Late-night comedians made jokes about Alaska's bridge to an empty island. The question everyone asked was, at a time when we have bridges and roads crumbling around the United States and traffic congestion worse than ever, why build a $200 million project that will serve only a few hundred people? The project became toxic. During her 2006 campaign, Sarah Palin supported the bridge, calling it essential infrastructure. However, after the national mockery intensified, she changed course and announced in 2007 that Alaska would not use state funds to complete the bridge, though she didn't return the federal money already allocated. The federal funding of $223 million that had been specifically designated for the bridge was eventually redirected to other Alaska transportation projects. Alaska kept the money and could spend it on whatever transportation projects it wanted. The bridge was never built. But strangely enough, Alaska continued building the Gravina Island Highway that connected to the bridge. The completed road is paved and well-maintained, running through forest on an island where almost nobody lives. The 3.2-mile road was supposed to connect the ferry terminal to the bridge approach, but since the bridge was never built, the road just ends at the shoreline. It's literally a road to nowhere, built at a cost of about $26 million, serving the 50 people who live on Gravina Island. The bridge to nowhere became one of the most famous infrastructure failures in American politics, despite never actually being built. It played a role in the 2008 presidential campaign, when Sarah Palin became John McCain's running mate. Her shifting positions on the bridge became a campaign issue. As of 2026, Ketchikan still takes the ferry to its airport, and the Gravina Island Highway still runs from the ferry terminal to nowhere. The road serves almost no purpose, except as a monument to the political controversy that killed the bridge. We now go to San Francisco, California, where the future of yet another megaproject remains up in smoke despite costing over $8 billion. The former naval yard located at Hunters Point was once the site of the largest U.S. facility for nuclear research. This was the location from where components of the atomic bomb, Little Boy, were loaded onto a heavy cruiser 1945. After the end of the Cold War, the shipyard was considered surplus to requirements, and the U.S. Navy decided to transform it into a residential development. The plan was to purge Hunters Point of its nuclear waste and build over 12,000 housing units, parks, and offices on it. In 2006, a company named Tetra Tech was awarded a cleanup contract worth $250 million. Tetra Tech cleared most of the land by 2012, at which point 2 different contractors started building homes on the clean land. However, while the construction continued, Tetra Tech found itself at the center of allegations related to cleanup fraud. Multiple whistleblowers who had previously worked with Tetra Tech came forward with evidence that the company had committed cleanup fraud. They had replaced hundreds of contaminated soil samples with clean ones to speed up the construction process. Tetra Tech blamed the fatal lapse on individual employees and agreed to a revised plan to get rid of the contamination. Construction continued, and by 2016, more than 200 homes had been transferred to residents who started to move in. But it wasn't long before the cleanup process came under further scrutiny. An independent review of Tetra Tech's data showed that the scale of fake testing was much greater than previously thought. In fact, almost half of the claimed cleanup work never happened. This proved to be the final straw for the ambitious development, which was immediately put on hold. More than $1 billion had already been spent on the project at this point. But the even bigger issue was the blatant disregard of public health. More than 300 units had already been transferred to buyers for $1 million each, despite a disastrous cleanup effort. It was later found that Tetra Tech wasn't the only one at fault. A 2018 review by the EPA found that the Navy had also understated the enormity of the contamination. Predictably enough, dozens of lawsuits followed. The homeowners collectively sued the developers, who then sued Tetra Tech, who then shifted blame to the U.S. Navy and even took the EPA to court, citing a lack of evidence. These lawsuits totaled up to $30 billion. However, in the last 5 years, only a few million dollars have been paid to the victims, with the prosecutors failing to settle on an acceptable number. Developers claim that the shipyard project can still become a reality as a new cleanup effort is underway. However, it may not be as straightforward because the contamination issue has become even bigger than in the past. That's according to a San Francisco grand jury findings of 2022 that labeled the previous cleanups useless. That's because the rising groundwater over the last decade has almost certainly given new life to previously dormant radioactive contaminants. This means that the whole thing might have to be built from scratch and may need tens of billions of dollars. Till then, the project's future remains up in smoke, and it is more than likely that the megaproject may soon be deemed unfeasible with billions going to waste. We now move to South Carolina, to another nuclear station, which could not keep up with its lofty promises. The V.C. Summer Nuclear Generating Station. Construction on South Carolina's V.C. Summer Nuclear Station began in 1973. 11 years later, Unit 1 reactor was ready for commercial operations, and it was an instant success. The plant cost $1.3 billion to construct, 24% less than the average of 13 nuclear plants constructed over the same time period. By 2004, the Unit 1 was going strong. However, power demand was rising across the state. Encouraged by the Unit 1 success, the state-owned South Carolina Power Company decided to expand the facilities with 2 new power plants that would serve consumers for another 60 years. However, the story of the new megaproject became a chronicle of failure. The plan was to add 2 Westinghouse AP1000 reactors that would be safer, simpler, and supposedly faster to build than previous reactor generations. The modular construction approach meant major components could be fabricated off-site and assembled on location, dramatically reducing construction time and costs compared to older nuclear plants that were essentially custom-built. The projected cost was $9.8 billion for both reactors, with completion in 2016 and 2019. The question was who was going to pay for it. On April 19, 2007, South Carolina's legislature passed a law allowing utilities to charge customers for construction costs before the plants opened. They aimed to spread the financial burden over years rather than hitting ratepayers with massive increases at once when the reactors went online. Construction began in 2013 with massive excitement. This would be the first new nuclear construction in the U.S. in 30 years. It would bring thousands of jobs and secure the state's energy future for generations. However, the problems started almost immediately, but were hidden from public view. Westinghouse's partner, Chicago Bridge and Iron, was building the modules but struggling with quality control and the complexity of nuclear-grade construction. The modules that were supposed to arrive ready for assembly showed up incomplete or poorly fabricated, driving up the costs while delaying the project further. Westinghouse, the company that was also providing nuclear reactors for the Vogtle nuclear plant expansion in Georgia, was under immense pressure. The Vogtle expansion project had been facing significant delays and was almost twice over budget. On March 29, 2017, Westinghouse filed for bankruptcy. That made it clear that the contractor would not be able to fulfill the $3.3 billion contract for Summer, leading to further cost increases. By 2017, the estimated cost of the project had risen to over $12 billion, more than 75% over the original budget. Moreover, it would not be finished until 2024, meaning that the consumers were left to pay billions more and wait a decade before reaping any benefits. Santee Cooper pulled the plug on the project by the end of 2017 after failing to find any new investors. Other partners followed lead and filed for bankruptcies because of the financial fallout from the project. Despite the abandonment, more than 700,000 South Carolina utility customers kept seeing charges related to the project on their monthly electric bills. The political fallout was immediate and brutal. South Carolina customers had been paying higher electric bills for years to fund construction of reactors that would now never generate a single watt of power. The revelations that executives knew the project was failing but lied about it triggered criminal investigations. In 2018, federal prosecutors charged former SCANA CEO Kevin Marsh and other executives with fraud for lying to investors and regulators about the project's true status. The Nukegate scandal, as it became known, destroyed SCANA's reputation and led to the company being acquired by Dominion Energy in a fire sale deal designed to protect ratepayers. Santee Cooper, the state-owned partner, faced its own investigations and leadership changes. The VC Summer site remains a working nuclear facility. Unit 1, built in the 1980s, continues operating successfully, but next to it stand the hulking concrete shells of Units 2 and 3, $9 billion worth of unfinished construction, slowly weathering in the South Carolina humidity. Through all the gloom, there now appears to be a silver lining for the abandoned site. Santee Cooper says it is considering reviving the project because of rising power demand, and it is looking for someone to own and operate the plant. Since the power plant is already partially built, the state enterprise is hopeful that it could be completed quickly. South Carolina state government officials have already investigated the site and found it to be in decent condition despite some surface rust. There are also encouraging signs as other left-for-dead nuclear projects, like the 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, are being revived to power data centers. However, there is no progress yet on this revival plan. For now, the reactors that were supposed to power the state for 60 years stand as a reminder of a colossal $9 billion failure. But if you think $9 billion was a huge waste, wait till you learn about the next megaproject on our list. California in 2008 faced a problem that had been getting worse for decades. The state's 3 major population centers were choking on their own growth. Los Angeles, the San Francisco Bay Area, and San Diego were sprawling outward. Highways were congested beyond capacity, and flying between cities meant dealing with airports that were operating at their limits. Driving from LA to San Francisco took 6 hours minimum in good traffic, often much longer. Flying took an hour in the air, but 3 hours door-to-door with airport security and connections. The solution seemed obvious: build what Europe and Japan had proven worked: high-speed rail. Trains traveling at 220 miles per hour could connect San Francisco and Los Angeles in under 3 hours. The California high-speed rail system would revolutionize travel in America's most populous state, taking cars off freeways and planes out of the sky while providing clean electric transportation for 40 million Californians. The total cost was estimated at $33 billion, with completion targeted for 2020. Federal funding would cover part of the cost, and private investors would supposedly finance much of the rest once the system proved viable. Voters approved the project in November 2000, authorizing $9 billion in bonds to start construction. The plan called for 520 miles of dedicated high-speed track running through the Central Valley, then splitting to serve both San Francisco and Los Angeles. Trains would stop in Sacramento, Fresno, Bakersfield, and other cities along the route. The system would eventually extend to San Diego, creating a network serving the entire state. Readership projections suggested 117 million passengers annually by 2030, enough to make the system sustainable through ticket sales. Construction was supposed to start quickly, with the first section opening by 2020 and the full SFLA route operational by 2028. The Obama administration awarded California $3.5 billion in federal stimulus funding in 2010, and the state began preliminary work. That's when reality started diverging from the vision. The environmental review process revealed problems that resulted in construction delays. The route passed through areas with endangered species, went near earthquake faults that required expensive engineering solutions, and crossed hundreds of properties that would need to be acquired. Every landowner fought acquisition, every environmental group demanded modifications, and every city along the route insisted on stations and design changes. What was supposed to be a streamlined approval process turned into years of lawsuits and negotiations. The cost estimates started climbing immediately. By 2012, the projected cost had reached $68 billion. By 2014, it was $77 billion. The timeline slipped to the late 2000s, then the early 2000s. The California High-Speed Rail Authority kept insisting the project was on track while simultaneously announcing delays and cost increases. Each revised business plan showed higher costs, longer timelines, and lower ridership projections. The route planning became politically impossible. Different cities demanded different routes, and California's environmental review laws gave opponents multiple ways to delay or block progress. By 2016, not a single mile of track had been laid, despite spending over $5 billion on planning, environmental reviews, land acquisition, and preliminary construction. Critics started calling it a train to nowhere, echoing the bridge to nowhere controversy. The project became politically toxic. Republicans opposed it as wasteful spending, and even some Democrats questioned whether California could actually build it. The authority pivoted to a new strategy in 2017. Build the Central Valley section first. The 119-mile segment from Madera to Bakersfield would be the initial operating segment, proving the system worked and generating revenue while the rest of the route was completed later. Construction in the Central Valley began in 2015 and continues as of 2025, though progress has been slower than projected. Viaducts are under construction, land is being graded for track, and some structures are complete. But the work is years behind schedule and billions over budget. The Central Valley section alone is now estimated to cost $35 billion, more than the entire system was supposed to cost in 2008. The San Francisco-LA vision has essentially died. Current cost estimates for completing the full system exceed $100 billion, with some analyses suggesting $128 billion or more. The timeline has been pushed to the 2040s or beyond, so far in the future that it's effectively meaningless. The California High-Speed Rail Authority no longer seriously claims the full system will be built as originally envisioned. The project has spent over $11 billion through 2024, with most of that going to land acquisition, environmental mitigation, and preliminary construction in the Central Valley. Not a single mile of operational track exists. The earliest the Merced-Bakersfield section might open is 2030 to 2033, though those dates have already slipped multiple times and will likely slip again. California High-Speed Rail hasn't been officially abandoned, but it's abandoned in the sense that the original vision is dead. The system voters approved SF to LA in under 3 hours for $33 billion by 2020 will never be built. What might eventually exist is a scaled-back Central Valley rail line that cost 3 times what the entire system was supposed to cost, serves a fraction of the intended destinations, and took decades longer than promised. The trains that were supposed to revolutionize California transportation remain hypothetical, existing only in renderings and promises. The track that voters approved in 2008 is still years away from carrying a single passenger. In 2025, the Trump administration announced cancellation of federal funding for the project, essentially stopping it altogether. What the California residents might eventually get is a hugely scaled-down version with no known timeline or cost estimate. California High-Speed Rail suffered from crippling administrative delays and the project turning into a political tool, similar to another megaproject that wasted billions in the 90s and was eventually abandoned altogether. In 1987, physicists convinced the US government to fund the most ambitious scientific experiment ever attempted on American soil. The Superconducting Supercollider would be a particle accelerator so powerful it would dwarf every other physics facility in the world, smashing protons together at energies high enough to reveal the fundamental structure of reality. The SSC would discover the Higgs boson, unlock mysteries of dark matter, and establish American dominance in particle physics for the next 50 years. The design called for a circular tunnel 87 kilometers in circumference, buried 30 meters underground in the Texas countryside near Waxahachie, about 30 miles south of Dallas. That's 3 times larger than Europe's Large Hadron Collider, big enough that the curvature of the tunnel would be barely noticeable to someone standing inside. Superconducting magnets would accelerate protons to 99.9999% the speed of light, then smash them together with 20 times more energy than any previous collider could achieve. The project's champions included top physicists who argued that fundamental science required this scale of investment. Understanding how the universe works at its most basic level, what gives particles mass, what dark matter is made of, whether there are extra dimensions, demanded energies the SSC could provide. Europe was building the LHC. That would be a smaller, weaker machine. The SSC would be the undisputed king of particle physics, and America would own it. Congress authorized the project in 1987 with an estimated cost of $4.4 billion and completion targeted for the mid-1990s. After evaluating proposals from multiple states, the Department of Energy selected Texas in 1988. The Dallas area offered flat terrain with stable geology and good infrastructure for supporting a massive construction project. Construction began in 1991. Workers started boring tunnels through the Austin Chalk Formation underlying the Texas prairie. The tunnel boring machines excavated circular passages 10 feet in diameter, and workers installed concrete lining to prevent collapse. The excavation progressed simultaneously from multiple access shafts, with crews working around the clock to dig out what would become the world's largest scientific instrument. By 1993, about 23 kilometers of tunnel were complete, roughly a quarter of the 87-kilometer ring. Two massive experimental halls had been excavated where particle detectors would be installed. Campus buildings were under construction to house physicists and equipment. Hundreds of superconducting magnets had been manufactured and were being tested. The project employed thousands of workers and seemed to be progressing toward its goal of operations beginning in 1999. But costs were spiraling. The $4.4 billion estimate from 1987 looked absurdly optimistic by 1992. New cost projections reached $8 billion, then $10 billion, then $12 billion as the technical challenges of building such an enormous facility became clear. Every kilometer of tunnel cost more than estimated. The superconducting magnets were harder to manufacture reliably than expected. The experimental detectors required custom engineering that consumed budgets. The timeline slipped from 1999 to the early 2000s. Congress started questioning why American taxpayers should fund this. The Cold War had ended, and the Soviet Union was no longer a scientific competitor requiring American dominance in particle physics. The federal deficit was growing, and domestic programs needed funding. Spending $12 billion to find exotic particles seemed hard to justify when infrastructure was crumbling and social programs were being cut. Physicists fought hard for the SSC. They testified before Congress explaining how the project would advance human knowledge and maintain American scientific leadership. However, the politics turned brutal through 1992 and 1993. The House of Representatives voted to cancel the SSC in June 1992, but the Senate restored funding. The battle repeated in 1993, with both chambers voting multiple times on whether to continue. Each vote was close, with margins of just a few votes determining whether the project lived or died. SSC supporters needed every vote, while opponents only needed to win once to kill the project permanently. On October 21, 1993, the House of Representatives voted 282 to 143 to terminate the superconducting super collider. The Senate didn't override the decision, and the project was officially dead. About $2 billion had been spent, with 23 kilometers of tunnel excavated, experimental halls dug, buildings constructed, and thousands of magnets manufactured. All of it became instantly worthless when Congress pulled the funding. The equipment was sold off in auctions. Superconducting magnets that cost millions to develop were sold for scrap value. Sophisticated instruments were bought by other labs for pennies on the dollar. The tunnel boring machines were sold to other projects. The experimental detector components were scrapped or repurposed. $2 billion of investment generated maybe $200 million in salvage value. The tunnels were simply abandoned. 23 kilometers of concrete-lined tunnels sat empty underground near Waxahachie. Without pumping, groundwater gradually flooded the lower sections. The access shafts were sealed, and the surface buildings were demolished or repurposed. The massive experimental halls, excavated spaces large enough to hold multi-story buildings, slowly filled with water. Today, the tunnels are still there, flooded and inaccessible, buried under Texas farmland. The surface shows almost no evidence the SSC ever existed. Some buildings were sold to private companies or the county government. The Superconducting Super Collider represents the most expensive scientific project ever abandoned. The $2 billion spent, roughly $4 billion in today's money, bought 23 kilometers of flooded tunnel, some buildings that got repurposed, and a lesson about the limits of American commitment to pure science. From a physics experiment that could not pass through Congress, we go to our final megaproject, another multi-billion-dollar plan that died at the hands of the American Parliament. The 1940s, when the first reactors went critical for the Manhattan Project. For over 80 years, that waste has been. By the 1980s, the situation was becoming untenable. Over 70,000 metric tons of high-level nuclear waste sat at more than 100 sites in 39 states, most of them near population centers, all of them temporary solutions waiting for a permanent answer. Congress decided in 1987 that the permanent answer would be Yucca Mountain, a remote ridge in the Nevada desert about 100 miles northwest of Las Vegas. The location seemed ideal, geologically stable, extremely dry, far from population centers, on land the federal government already owned for nuclear testing. The plan called for tunneling deep into the mountain to create a repository that could safely store 77,000 metric tons of nuclear waste for 10,000 years. The waste would be sealed in corrosion-resistant containers and buried 1,000 feet underground in tunnels carved through volcanic rock, isolated from groundwater and protected by Nevada's arid climate. The Department of Energy projected that Yucca Mountain could open by 1998 at a cost of about $1 billion. Nuclear utilities would pay fees into a fund that would finance construction and operation, and America's nuclear waste problem would finally have a solution. The waste sitting in temporary storage at reactor sites could be transported to Nevada and buried permanently, eliminating the risk of accidents or contamination at dozens of locations nationwide. Nevada exploded in opposition. State officials, environmental groups, and residents near the site argued that the federal government was turning Nevada into America's nuclear dumping ground. The state hadn't chosen this. Congress had forced it on them through the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, which specifically designated Yucca Mountain after considering and rejecting sites in other states. Nevada had no nuclear power plants of its own, but would receive everyone else's waste. The politics were toxic from the start, with Nevadans feeling they'd been unfairly targeted because their state lacked the political power to resist. Despite Nevada's opposition, site characterization began in the early 1990s. The Department of Energy started extensive geological studies, drilling boreholes, conducting seismic surveys, and analyzing the rock formations. A 5-mile exploratory tunnel was bored into the mountain using a tunnel boring machine that carved a passage 25 feet in diameter through the volcanic tuff. The tunnel allowed scientists to directly examine the geology and test whether Yucca Mountain could actually contain nuclear waste as predicted. The geological studies revealed complications. The water table was higher than initial surveys suggested, meaning contamination could potentially reach groundwater faster than models predicted. Earthquake faults ran closer to the site than originally thought. The volcanic rock was more porous in some areas, raising questions about how quickly radiation could migrate. Each discovery required new analysis and revised predictions, and Nevada's opponents used every finding as evidence that the site was unsuitable. The cost estimates started climbing as the technical challenges became clearer. By the late 1990s, projections reached $8 billion. By 2005, estimates hit $15 billion. The 1998 opening date had long since passed, replaced by targets of 2010, then 2017, then 2020. Each delay cost money for ongoing studies and maintenance of a site that wasn't accepting waste. The project progressed despite Nevada's resistance. In 2002, after years of study and debate, the Department of Energy officially recommended Yucca Mountain to President Bush, and Congress approved it over Nevada's objection. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission began the licensing process to authorize construction. The repository seemed on track to finally open in the 2000s. Then politics intervened decisively. Barack Obama won the 2008 presidential election with strong support from Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, a Nevada Democrat who'd made stopping Yucca Mountain his personal crusade. In 2010, the Obama administration announced it was terminating the project, the Department of Energy withdrew its license application with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, defunded the program, and created a commission to study alternatives to Yucca Mountain. The cancellation came after spending over $15 billion on studies, tunnel construction, and licensing work. The 5-mile exploratory tunnel was complete. Detailed geological characterization had been done. The license application was pending. The project was years away from actually storing waste, but billions had been spent proving the site was viable. Nevada celebrated the decision as a victory. Federal officials who'd spent careers working on Yucca Mountain were reassigned or retired. The facility that was supposed to solve America's nuclear waste problem was abandoned, and the waste remains exactly where it's been for decades, sitting in temporary storage at reactor sites across the country. The Yucca Mountain site still exists, essentially mothballed. The exploratory tunnel is there, sealed but intact. The surface facilities are maintained at a minimal level. The waste problem Yucca Mountain was supposed to solve hasn't gone away. It's gotten worse. Over 90,000 metric tons of spent fuel now sits at reactor sites, more than Yucca Mountain was designed to hold. Some reactors have shut down but can't fully decommission because their waste has nowhere to go. The temporary solutions from the 1970s and 1980s are still in place 50 years later, with no permanent alternative in sight. Congress occasionally discusses reviving Yucca Mountain. The Trump administration tried to restart the licensing process in 2017, but faced Nevada's continued opposition and couldn't secure funding. The Biden administration showed no interest in pursuing it. The political dynamics haven't changed. Nevada still opposes the repository, and no other state wants to volunteer as a replacement. The waste continues sitting in temporary storage because the permanent solution was abandoned after $15 billion and 30 years of work. The political opposition from Nevada, combined with changing federal priorities, killed a project that was closer to completion than most abandoned megaprojects ever get. What do you think of these construction debacles? What went wrong, and is there hope for any of these expensive failures? Comment your thoughts below. You can go from mega disasters to massive success, and check out our video on United States' biggest megaprojects under construction. Keep watching SIGNUM for more stories from the world of megaprojects.